December 24th, 1944. Near Bastogne, Belgium. 2,147 hours. Gefreiter Klaus Hartmann presses his body against the frozen earth of his foxhole, his breath crystallizing in the bitter December air as artillery rumbles in the distance like thunder trapped beneath the earth. The Ardennes winter has wrapped itself around the German lines with cruelty that rivals any enemy weapon. Temperatures plunging to minus 15 Celsius. Snow falling in thick curtains that obscure vision beyond 50 meters. Wind that cuts through wool and leather as though they were paper. Hartmann's company has been fighting since the offensive began 8 days ago, pushing through these Belgian forests with the desperate energy of men who know this is Germany's last gamble. His stomach aches with hunger. The promised supplies have not arrived. The logistics that were supposed to follow the advancing spearheads have collapsed somewhere behind him, and he has been surviving on half rations and whatever can be scavenged from abandoned American positions. His feet, wrapped in rags inside disintegrating boots, have lost most feeling. Around him in the darkness, other soldiers from his regiment hunker in similar holes, silent, exhausted, clinging to weapons that are increasingly difficult to operate with frostbitten fingers. The offensive that Hitler promised would split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp has stalled. Hartmann knows this even if the officers will not say it. The Americans, caught by surprise initially, have recovered with terrifying speed. The surrounded garrison at Bastogne refuses to surrender. And now, on Christmas Eve, Hartmann finds himself in a sector where the lines have stabilized, where German and American positions face each other across a frozen field perhaps 200 meters wide, close enough to hear each other, close enough to know that across that snowy expanse are other cold, tired, hungry men who also want nothing more than to survive this night. And then, cutting through the wind and the distant artillery, comes a sound so unexpected that Hartmann thinks at first he is hallucinating from cold and exhaustion. Voices, American voices, singing, not war cries or taunts, but singing, and the song, filtering across the frozen battlefield in accented but recognizable German, is Still Nacht, Silent Night. The Americans are singing a German Christmas carol. To Germans, on Christmas Eve, in the middle of a battle that has cost thousands of lives, Hartmann feels something crack inside him, some carefully maintained barrier between the soldier he must be and the human being he once was. Other German soldiers emerge cautiously from their positions, drawn by the singing. Someone in the German line begins singing in response. Then more voices join. For perhaps 15 minutes, on a frozen battlefield in Belgium, German and American soldiers sing Christmas carols to each other across a killing ground, and Klaus Hartmann experiences a cognitive dissonance, so profound it will stay with him for the rest of his life. These enemies, these Americans who his officers told him were Mongol barbarians without culture or honor, are singing his Christmas hymns in his language, reaching across the lines on the holiest night of the Christian year, with a gesture that acknowledges their shared humanity. When the singing ends and silence returns, punctuated only by wind and distant guns, Hartmann sits in his frozen hole and weeps, not from cold or fear or exhaustion, but from the sudden, overwhelming recognition that everything has been told about this war, about the enemy, about the necessity of fighting to the last breath, might be founded on lies. What do you think goes through a soldier's mind when his enemy demonstrates humanity he was taught they did not possess? When the propaganda that sustains your ability to fight suddenly reveals itself as hollow? Consider what you know about the Ardennes offensive, about the desperation of Germany's final gamble, and ask yourself, what does it mean when soldiers discover they have more in common with their enemies than with the ideologies that sent them to kill each other? The story of German soldiers experiencing Christmas gestures from Allied troops during World War II begins not with a single incident, but with a recurring pattern that violated every expectation German military indoctrination had created, a pattern that demonstrated a profound gulf between totalitarian and democratic approaches to warfare, between ideologies that dehumanized enemies and cultures that retained recognition of shared humanity even in the midst of total war. German soldiers in 1944 were the product over a decade of National Socialist indoctrination, propaganda that portrayed Germany's enemies, particularly the Western Allies, as degenerate, racially mixed peoples without authentic culture, as capitalist exploiters whose soldiers lacked the fighting spirit and ideological commitment that characterized German troops. The Americans were described as soft, undisciplined, motivated by material comfort rather than higher purpose, incapable of sustaining combat against the ideologically pure warriors of the Third Reich. Soviet soldiers were portrayed as Asiatic barbarians, British soldiers as exhausted remnants of a dying empire. And yet, as the war turned against Germany and Wehrmacht soldiers found themselves fighting defensive battles on multiple fronts, experiencing defeat and retreat for the first time after years of victory, they began encountering evidence that contradicted these propaganda narratives. The evidence appeared in many forms: the overwhelming material superiority of Allied forces, the efficiency of American logistics, the determination of soldiers who were supposed to be soft and uncommitted. But perhaps nothing challenged German soldiers' indoctrination more directly than the Christmas gestures that occurred repeatedly during the war's final winters, moments when Allied troops, particularly Americans, extended recognition of shared holiday traditions, moments that acknowledged the humanity of men who were technically enemies, but who were also fellow Christians observing the same sacred season. The Christmas truce of 1914, during World War I, had become legendary. The spontaneous ceasefire along portions of the Western Front where British and German soldiers emerged from trenches, exchanged gifts, sang carols, even played football in no man's land before returning to killing each other. That famous incident had occurred when the war was still young, before the full horror of industrial slaughter had hardened men's hearts. By World War II, particularly by its final years, the scale of violence and the totalitarian ideologies that drove it seemed to preclude such gestures. The Nazi regime had worked systematically to eliminate traditional Christian influences from German culture, replacing them with neo-pagan Germanic mythology and the cult of Hitler. Christmas itself had been rebranded as a winter solstice celebration, stripped of its Christian content, turned into a celebration of Aryan heritage. German soldiers were taught to fight without mercy, to see warfare as an existential struggle where only total victory or total annihilation were possible outcomes. And yet, despite this indoctrination, when Allied soldiers extended Christmas gestures, carol singing, temporary ceasefires, shouted greetings of Merry Christmas or Frohe Weihnachten across the lines, German soldiers responded not with the ideological hostility they had been taught, but with profound emotional reactions that revealed how thin the veneer of propaganda really was, how deep the human need for connection and meaning remained even in the midst of mechanized death. The Christmas season of 1944 saw multiple documented instances of such exchanges. The Ardennes Offensive, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, began on December 16th, achieving initial surprise but quickly bogging down against determined American resistance and deteriorating weather that grounded the Luftwaffe and prevented German forces from exploiting their early gains. By Christmas Eve, German spearheads had stalled. The surrounded American garrison at Bastogne had refused to surrender, and German soldiers found themselves trapped in positions without adequate supplies, freezing in the bitter winter, watching their offensive collapse despite the sacrifices it had cost. In multiple sectors, as night fell on December 24th, isolated incidents occurred where German and American soldiers, sometimes without authorization from their commands, established informal truces for the evening, shouted Christmas greetings to each other, sang carols, occasionally even ventured into no man's land to exchange small items, cigarettes, chocolate, schnapps, before returning to their lines and resuming combat the next day. These incidents were not official truces like 1914's famous episode. They were localized, brief, often involving only small numbers of troops in isolated sectors. But they occurred repeatedly enough that reports filtered back through both military hierarchies, troubling German officers who recognized that such fraternization undermined the ideological certainty required to sustain fighting in a clearly losing cause. What do you think military commanders on both sides thought of these incidents? Did Allied officers see them as evidence of German demoralization, as propaganda opportunities, or as problematic fraternization that might undermine their own troops' fighting spirit? Did German officers see them as dangerous defeatism that needed to be suppressed, or did they recognize, as many surviving accounts suggest some did, that these moments of shared humanity were inevitable when men who shared cultural and religious traditions found themselves celebrating the same holiday in close proximity, even as enemies? The sound of carols sung across battlefields became, in these final months of the European War, a recurring symbol of the profound contradictions at the heart of the German war effort. The carols, still nacked, O Tannenbaum, Es ist ein Rosensprungen, were German cultural products, songs that had emerged from German religious and folk traditions over centuries. When American or British soldiers sang them, sometimes in halting German learned phonetically or remembered from immigrant communities, they were demonstrating a cultural connection that Nazi ideology denied existed. The propaganda had taught German soldiers that Americans were culturally empty, a mongrel nation without authentic traditions. But here were American soldiers singing German Christmas hymns, demonstrating not just knowledge of German culture, but respect for it, even in the midst of a war against a regime that claimed to represent that culture. For German soldiers who retained any religious faith, and many did, despite Nazi efforts to supplant Christianity, the Christmas season carried profound significance. It was a time when, even in the midst of horror, one was supposed to remember peace on earth, goodwill toward men. The cognitive dissonance of hearing those ancient calls for peace sung by men you were supposed to be killing created psychological pressure that no amount of indoctrination could fully relieve. Oberstfreiter Ernst Bauer, serving with a Wehrmacht infantry division in the Ardennes, wrote in a letter that was later captured and preserved in American archives, "On Christmas Eve we heard the Americans singing across the valley. At first we thought it was a trick, some attempt to get us to expose our positions. But they were singing Silent Night in German, badly pronounced but sincere. Our lieutenant said nothing, did not order us to fire or to maintain silence. After they finished, someone in our company began singing in response. Then more joined. For perhaps 20 minutes we sang Christmas carols back and forth with men, who tomorrow we will try to kill and who will try to kill us. I do not understand this war anymore. I do not understand what we are fighting for if our enemies know our songs, respect our traditions, and wish us a Merry Christmas even as they defeat us. The officers say we fight for Germany, for our families, for our honor. But what honor is there in this? What are we defending if the enemy shows more humanity than our own leadership, which sends us to freeze and die in positions that cannot be held for a cause that cannot be won? The contrast between what German soldiers have been taught to expect and what they actually experienced when captured or when they had extended contact with Allied forces became one of the great psychological pressures of the war's final phase. Propaganda had promised that capture by the Western Allies meant torture, starvation, death. German soldiers have been shown fabricated images of Allied atrocities, had been told stories of prisoners being executed or abused, had been taught that surrender was not merely tactical defeat, but existential catastrophe. The threat of Soviet captivity gave this propaganda some credibility. Soviet treatment of German prisoners was indeed harsh, shaped by the unspeakable cruelties Germany had inflicted on Soviet populations during the invasion. But the Western Allies operated under different principles, and German soldiers who were captured by Americans or British discovered that the propaganda had been almost entirely lies. They were processed through systems that provided medical care, adequate food, shelter, and treatment that, while certainly not luxurious, accorded them basic human dignity and protection under the Geneva Convention. POW camps in the United States and Britain, while varying in quality, generally provided conditions that German soldiers found surprisingly humane, sometimes superior to what they had experienced in their own military service. The Christmas season amplified these contrasts. In POW camps, American administrators often facilitated Christmas observations for prisoners, allowing religious services, providing special meals, even permitting prisoners to construct Christmas decorations and observances that connected them to their cultural traditions. These gestures were not merely humanitarian impulses, though they were partly that. They were also strategic, part of an Allied information warfare approach that recognized that demonstrating the superiority of democratic values to captured enemy soldiers might contribute to post-war reconstruction. But for German prisoners experiencing Christmas in Allied captivity, the motivation mattered less than the reality. They were being allowed, even encouraged, to observe their most important cultural and religious holiday, while their own regime had been systematically attempting to strip that holiday of its Christian content and subordinate it to Nazi ideology. The irony was not lost on many prisoners. The democratic enemies their leadership had demonized were allowing them more religious freedom than their own totalitarian government had permitted. Lance Corporal Heinrich Boll, the future Nobel Prize-winning author who served on the Western Front, wrote in his wartime letters and post-war reflections about the profound psychological impact of recognizing Allied humanity. We have been taught that the Americans were incapable of true culture, that they were a society of materialists without spiritual depth. But when they shouted Merry Christmas to us across the lines, when they sang our hymns in our language, when captured comrades returned from interrogation, not tortured and brutalized as we had been promised, but fed and treated as human beings, a terrible doubt began to grow. Perhaps we were not fighting for civilization against barbarism. Perhaps we were the barbarians, and the civilization we've been taught to defend was itself the lie. This realization came slowly, resisted desperately, because to accept it meant accepting that everything we had endured, everything we had done, had been in service of evil rather than good. But the evidence kept accumulating, and the Christmas carols sung across frozen battlefields were part of that evidence. Proof that our enemies retained moral principles we had been taught to abandon. What do you think sustained German soldiers' willingness to fight after such realizations? Was it fear of consequences for surrender, residual loyalty to comrades even as loyalty to cause eroded, simple inertia, and the absence of alternatives, or something else? How long can men continue fighting when they no longer believe in the purpose of the fight? The Christmas gestures between German and Allied troops occurred in other theaters as well. In Italy, where Allied and German forces face each other across mountainous terrain in a grinding campaign of limited mobility, Christmas 1944 saw multiple documented instances of informal local truces, carol exchanges, and shouted greetings. In one notable incident near the Gothic Line, German and American positions, separated by a narrow valley, engaged in an impromptu carol competition, with each side singing hymns and folk songs, sometimes in each other's languages, for several hours on Christmas Eve before returning to combat routines the following morning. In these isolated sectors where front lines remained stable for extended periods, German and Allied soldiers sometimes developed a wary mutual respect born of shared hardship. They fought the same weather, dealt with similar supply problems, endured the same tedious routines of frontline life punctuated by sudden violence. The Christmas exchanges acknowledged this shared experience while simultaneously highlighting the fundamental moral difference between the sides. Allied troops could extend such gestures without fear of punishment from their own commands, while German troops who reciprocated risked denunciation for defeatism or lack of ideological commitment. The Nazi regime's response to reports of Christmas fraternization was telling. Orders were issued prohibiting any interaction with enemy forces that was not strictly military, threatening severe punishment for soldiers who engaged in unauthorized communication with the enemy. The regime recognized that such interactions undermined the dehumanization necessary to sustain fighting in a lost cause. If German soldiers began seeing Allied troops as fellow human beings rather than existential enemies, if they recognized that surrender might lead to decent treatment rather than torture and death, the will to continue sacrificing for a clearly failing cause would evaporate. The propaganda had to be maintained at all costs. The image of the enemy as inhuman had to be preserved, because without it the entire ideological structure justifying the war's continuation would collapse. But orders from distant commands could not entirely suppress the human impulses that emerged when men who share cultural and religious traditions found themselves in close proximity on the night that their shared faith designated as a celebration of peace and human redemption. The Christmas carols sung across battlefields in 1944 and 1945 represented small-scale rebellions against the ideological totality the Nazi regime demanded, assertions of common humanity that transcended the artificial hatreds the war required. The psychological transformation many German soldiers underwent as a result of these and similar experiences contributed to the relatively rapid success of post-war denazification efforts in the Western occupation zones. Men who had recognized through direct experience that Allied propaganda about democratic values was more truthful than Nazi propaganda about Allied barbarism were more receptive to political re-education that accompanied occupation. The Christmas carols, the decent treatment in POW camps, the thousand small indicators of the enemy possessed moral principles that Nazi ideology rejected. These created cognitive frameworks that made the post-war democratic reconstruction possible. The contrast was particularly stark with German soldiers who had fought exclusively on the Eastern Front, where the ideological war had been far more absolute on both sides, where German atrocities had provoked Soviet responses in kind, where the propaganda about enemy barbarism had more factual basis. For soldiers whose experience of the enemy came primarily from the Western Allies, the recognition that democratic societies could wage total war while maintaining certain moral boundaries created powerful lessons about the relative merits of different political systems. The sound of Still Nacht, sung in accented English or German, floating across frozen Belgian forests or Italian mountains, carried meanings that extended far beyond the immediate moment. The carol itself, written in 1818 by an Austrian priest and schoolteacher in a small alpine village, had become one of the most widely recognized Christmas hymns in the Christian world. Translated into hundreds of languages, sung in churches and homes across continents. Its message of peace, of divine light entering a dark world, of hope transcending present suffering, resonated with profound irony when sung by men engaged in mechanized slaughter. But that irony itself carried power. It highlighted the gap between the world as it was and the world as it should be, between the reality of war and the possibility of peace, between the hatreds ideologies required and the common humanity that persisted despite them. When American soldiers sang Still Nacht to German soldiers on Christmas Eve 1944, they were performing a kind of cultural diplomacy that no amount of leaflet propaganda could match, demonstrating through direct action that they valued German cultural achievements, even while fighting to destroy the Nazi regime that claimed to represent German civilization. Lieutenant Otto Skorzeny, who participated in special operations during the Ardennes Offensive, recorded in his post-war account an incident on Christmas Eve when American and German soldiers briefly ceased fire in a wooded area and exchanged seasonal greetings. We heard singing from the American positions, Christmas hymns, some in English, some in what I recognized as German, though badly pronounced. My men looked at me, uncertain how to respond. We were under orders to maintain aggression, to show no weakness, to treat the enemy as the propaganda described them. But it was Christmas Eve, and these were hymns I had known since childhood, songs my mother had sung. I did not stop my men when they began singing in response. For perhaps half an hour there was no shooting in our sector, only voices in the darkness singing the old songs. When it ended and we returned to war, something had changed. The Americans were no longer abstract enemies, but men who knew the same hymns, who missed their families as we missed ours, who want to survive this war and return home. This made fighting them harder, not easier, because it became difficult to hate men who had shown us that humanity transcends politics. What do you think such experiences mean for the possibility of reconciliation after conflict? If soldiers can recognize each other's humanity even in the midst of war, does that create foundations for a peace that pure military victory cannot establish? Or are these moments of recognition merely temporary breaks in the fundamental reality that war requires dehumanization to function? The Christmas season of 1944 was particularly significant because it came at a moment when the outcome of the war was essentially decided, but Germany continued fighting despite the inevitability of defeat. The Ardennes Offensive represented Hitler's last gamble, a desperate attempt to change the strategic balance through a surprise attack that achieved initial tactical success, but quickly foundered against Allied material superiority and German logistical collapse. By Christmas 1944, most German soldiers with any strategic awareness recognized that the war was lost. Germany was being bombed around the clock. Its cities reduced to rubble, its industrial capacity steadily degraded. Soviet armies were approaching from the east, Allied armies from the west. No rational assessment of the situation suggested Germany could win, and yet the fighting continued for 5 more months, with hundreds of thousands more deaths, because the Nazi regime demanded total commitment to the end, and because German soldiers, even those who had lost faith in Nazi ideology, continued fighting from some combination of discipline, fear of consequences for surrender, loyalty to comrades, and the absence of alternatives. In this context, the Christmas gestures from Allied troops carried particular weight. They represented not triumphalism or contempt from victors toward the defeated, but recognition that the German soldiers trapped in this desperate situation remained human beings deserving of some acknowledgement of shared traditions and shared humanity. The American soldiers who participated in these Christmas exchanges came from a different military culture than their German opponents. The U.S. military, while certainly capable of great violence, and while fighting a war that was ideologically understood as a crusade against totalitarian evil, maintained certain boundaries that the Nazi regime rejected. American soldiers were citizens in uniform, not warriors of a totalitarian state. They retained rights even in military service, including religious freedom that extended to respecting religious observances. American military culture included strong Christian influences. Chaplains served with combat units, religious services were regularly held, and major Christian holidays like Christmas were recognized as significant even in combat zones. American soldiers singing Christmas carols were not violating military discipline, but expressing cultural values their military accommodated and even encouraged. This created a fundamental asymmetry. Allied soldiers could extend Christmas gestures freely as expressions of their own cultural and religious traditions, while German soldiers who reciprocated were technically violating the ideological discipline their regime demanded. The broader pattern of American abundance manifesting itself in how soldiers were treated extended to holiday observances. American units in the field, even during active combat operations, received special Christmas rations, holiday packages from home, mail service that connected them to families celebrating the season in the United States. The industrial and logistical systems that supported American military operations included the capacity to deliver small luxuries and morale-building services that German logistics, barely able to deliver basic ammunition and food, could not match. German soldiers, observing American positions where Christmas was celebrated with special meals, decorations, even Christmas trees and gifts distributed through military channels, recognized another dimension of the vast disparity in national capabilities. The Americans could afford to celebrate Christmas in the field because their logistics system had capacity beyond bare necessities. Germany could not because German culture valued Christmas less, but because German resources were stretched beyond breaking trying to sustain basic combat operations. Private Werner Krauss, captured near Bastogne on December 26, 1944, described in post-war interviews his shock at the Christmas celebration he observed in an American POW processing center. We were taken to a building where American military police were processing prisoners. It was the day after Christmas, and the Americans had clearly celebrated. There were still decorations up, remnants of special meals, a Christmas tree with lights powered by a generator. One American soldier, noticing my interest, told me through an interpreter that they had received special rations for a Christmas dinner. Turkey, which I had not eaten in years, real vegetables, desserts, even Coca-Cola. He said this casually, as though it were obvious that soldiers should celebrate Christmas properly even in a war zone. I remember thinking that we had truly lost this war not because our soldiers were less brave or less skilled, but because we were fighting an enemy whose abundance was so vast that they could celebrate Christmas with turkey dinners while defeating us. The contrast with our Christmas, spent freezing in foxholes, eating cold rations if we had any food at all, forbidden from making lights or fires that might draw artillery, prohibited from singing carols because it might reveal positions, was absolute. In that moment, I understood that the war had been lost before it began, that Germany never had the resources or the system to defeat an opponent who could field millions of soldiers and still celebrate Christmas with turkey dinners. The theological and philosophical implications of Christmas gestures between Christian soldiers engaged in total war were not lost on religious leaders on both sides. Allied military chaplains generally encouraged such expressions of Christian fellowship, seeing them as consistent with religious teaching even in the midst of justified warfare against Nazi evil. German military chaplains, those who remained in service despite Nazi hostility to institutional Christianity, often struggle with the contradiction between Christian teaching about peace and brotherhood and the regime's demand for total war. Some Protestant and Catholic chaplains used the Christmas season to subtly question the Nazi regime's ideological claims, reminding German soldiers in sermons and services that Christianity transcended national identity and recognized the common humanity of all people. This was dangerous, as chaplains who too explicitly contradicted Nazi ideology faced removal or worse. But the Christmas season provided some cover for messages that might have been prohibited at other times. And for some German soldiers, these messages reinforced the doubts created by direct experience with Allied humanity. The transformation in German soldiers' perception of the enemy that these Christmas encounters produced was not universal or immediate. Many soldiers maintained their ideological commitment despite contradictory evidence. Others dismissed such incidents as anomalies or as Allied psychological warfare tactics. But for a significant number, the cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught to expect and what they actually experienced when Allied troops extended Christmas gestures created permanent shifts in understanding. These soldiers recognized that propaganda was lies, that the enemy possessed moral principles their own regime rejected, that the cause they fought for was not the defense of civilization, but its opposite. This recognition sometimes produced psychological crisis. The realization that one had participated in great evil in service of lies is not easily borne. But it also produced a foundation for genuine transformation, for the rejection of totalitarian ideology and the embrace of democratic values that characterized much of post-war West German society. By the final Christmas of the war in Europe, December 1944, the sound of carols sung across front lines carried meanings that both German and Allied soldiers understood implicitly. For the Allies, it represented confidence in approaching victory, generosity of spirit that could afford to acknowledge enemy humanity because the outcome was no longer in doubt, and reaffirmation of the values, including Christian mercy and democratic respect for human dignity, that the war was being fought to defend. For German soldiers, it represented recognition of shared traditions despite political enmity, proof that the enemy retained moral boundaries their own regime had abandoned, and painful evidence that everything they'd been taught about Allied barbarism was false. The carols became a kind of dialogue, a communication between enemies that transcended the war's violence and acknowledged that political conflicts, however intense, did not erase cultural connections or shared humanity. The epilogue to these Christmas encounters came in the post-war years, as veterans on both sides attempted to make sense of their experiences. German veterans writing memoirs and participating in reconciliation efforts repeatedly cited such incidents as pivotal moments in their psychological journey from Nazi ideology to democratic values. Allied veterans, when they mentioned these incidents at all, often described them as reminders of what they were fighting for, a world where such expressions of common humanity would not require suspension of hostilities, where people could acknowledge their shared traditions without first requiring that they be locked in combat. The Christmas carols sung across Belgian forests and Italian mountains in 1944 and 1945 became part of the larger narrative of how democracies fought World War II differently than totalitarian powers, how they waged total war without totally abandoning the humanitarian principles that distinguish their cause from their enemies. What lessons do these moments carry for understanding not just World War II, but the nature of conflict itself? That ideologies which require dehumanization of enemies ultimately fail when confronted with human reality? That shared cultural and religious traditions create connections that politics cannot entirely sever? That the way wars are fought, the boundaries maintained or abandoned, the humanity recognized or denied, matters as much as why wars are fought? The German soldiers who heard Americans singing Still Nacht across frozen battlefields learned these lessons through direct experience, and their testimony reminds us that even in the midst of total war, even when propaganda demands absolute enmity, the human capacity for recognizing shared humanity persists, waiting for any opportunity to assert itself against the artificial hatreds that war requires. The sound of those Christmas carols, Still Nacht, O Tannenbaum, ist es in Rosenspringen, floating across contested ground where men crouched in frozen holes waiting to kill each other, represents something profound about the limits of ideology and the persistence of shared culture. The songs have been written centuries before the Nazi regime existed and would endure long after its destruction. They connected men across the battle lines to traditions deeper and older than the political conflicts that had turned them into enemies. They reminded soldiers on both sides that they were not merely warriors serving ideologies, but human beings participating in ancient traditions, observing holidays that their grandparents had observed, singing songs their children would sing. In this reminder lay both hope and tragedy. Hope that human connections could survive even the worst violence politics could inflict, tragedy that it required such violence to reveal how deep those connections ran. The German soldiers who wept in their foxholes after hearing Americans sing Christmas carols in German wept not from weakness, but from recognition. Recognition that they'd been lied to, that they fought for a cause that betrayed rather than defended their civilization, that the enemy showed more respect for German cultural traditions than the regime claiming to represent German interests. This recognition came too late to change the war's outcome, but not too late to plant seeds for the reconstruction that would follow, for the transformation of German society that would build something better from the ruins. And in that transformation, the memory of Christmas carols sung across battle lines would serve as a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, even in wars of existential intensity, the capacity for recognizing our common humanity persists, waiting for any chance to assert itself, offering hope that the hatred's politics creates need not be permanent, that peace remains possible not merely as the absence of war, but as the restoration of the human connections that war attempts but ultimately fails to destroy.